Erol Bileci'yi konferansın açılışı için podyuma davet ediyorum.
Çok değerli Kemal Hocam, nazik davetiniz için ve bütün katılımlarınız için biz de canı yürekten çok teşekkür ederiz. Çok değerli konuklar, çok değerli basın mensupları, sevgili başkanlar, sevgili üyeler, hanımefendiler, beyefendiler. Sizleri öncelikle şahsım ve TÜSİAD Yönetim Kurulu adına saygı ve sevgiyle selamlıyorum. Tekrardan hoş geldiniz. Bildiğiniz gibi Brookings sadece Amerika Birleşik Devletleri için değil, dünyanın da en önemli düşünce kuruluşlarının başında geliyor. Ve yine hepimizin veya da birçoğumuzun takip ettiği üzere TÜSİAD olarak Brookings ile yaklaşık 10 yılı aşkın bir süredir Türkiye programını yürütüyoruz bildiğiniz gibi. TÜSİAD'ın kıdemli araştırmacısı, çok değerli Profesör Doktor Kemal Kirişçi'nin koordinasyonunda süren bu devam eden programımız gerek Washington'da gerekse İstanbul'da düzenlenen ve fevkalade zengin içerikli konferans ve yayınlarıyla gerçekten oldukça başarılı sonuçlar verip hakikaten bütün kamuoyuna, topluma ve düşünce kuruluşlarına ve iş dünyasına başarılı, katma değerli sonuçlar üretmekte. Bugün hep birlikte kayıp ütopyalar ve korkulan distopyalar arasında liberal dünya düzeninin geleceğini tartışacağız. Konu başlığı son derece değerli. Bir miktar ilk etapta belki tek cümleyle anlaşılması belki biraz zor olmasına rağmen ama biraz içeriğine baktığınız zaman da son derece detaylı olduğunu göreceksiniz ve çok değerli konuşmacılarımız da bu fevkalade zenginleşerek hepimize ulaşacak. Bildiğiniz gibi ütopya iyi, güzel ve mükemmel bir tasarımla kurgulanmış toplumlardır. Ütopya iyi bir dünya çizerken distopya kötü bir dünya çizer. İyimserlik ve kötümserliğin arasında ise epince aslında bir çizgi vardır. O da gerçekçiliktir. Biz bugün bu konuyu enine boyuna gerçekçi olarak değerlendirebilir isek, dünyanın geleceğinin ibresini hayal ettiğimiz tarafa bir miktar çekme şansımız olur diye düşünüyorum. Çünkü Shakespeare'in de bir sözüyle iyi bir veyahut da kötü diye bir şey aslında yoktur. Düşünce onu nasıl isterse öyle yapar. Sözünü de bu vesileyle paylaşmak istiyorum. Çok değerli konuklar, liberal dünya düzeninin geleceği aslında fevkalade ve oldukça hassas bir konu. Çünkü bugün liberal düzen hem kendi içinden hem de ama bir o kadar da kendi dışından fevkalade ciddi saldırılarla karşı karşıya. Oysa küresel liberal düzenin korunması ve geliştirilmesi kurallara dayalı, özgür, demokratik ve refah seviyesi yüksek bir dünyada yaşamak isteyen herkesin üzerine fazlasıyla titremesi gereken aslında bir konu. Hepimizin aşina olduğu küresel liberal düzen çok taraflı, temel insan haklarına dayalı, demokratik rejimlere ve kurallı piyasa ekonomilerine dayanır. Ve bu tanım ilk olarak bildiğiniz gibi 11 Eylül saldırıları sonrasında jeopolitik yönden de ve daha sonra da 2008 yılı küresel kriz sonrasında ekonomik yönden de oldukça sarsıldı. Bugün bir yanda baktığımız zaman küreselleşmenin iyi yönetilmemesinden kaynaklanan fevkalade ciddi sorunlar var dünyada. Diğer yandan ise korumacı eğilimlerle gündeme gelen müthiş bir artık boyuta ulaşan ticaret savaşları var. Ekonomileri Batı standartlarında düzenleyici, çok taraflı ticaret ve yatırım anlaşmaları siyaseten gerçekten fevkalade zora giriyor. Ve serbest dolaşımının önüne yeni engeller çıkarılıyor. Kısaca bugün baktığımız zaman dünyadaki özellikle bu yöndeki daha doğrusu hava oldukça sisli ve şartlarda bir o kadar çetin. Çok değerli konuklar. Ekonomik küreselleşme, siyasal küreselleşmeyi mutlaka beraberinde getiriyor. Ziya hocamızın eminim konferans sırasında da panel sırasında daha iyi belirteceği üzere. Bugün karşımızda maalesef siyaseten parçalanma eğilimi gösteren bir dünya var. Bu önümüzde duruyor ve her gün maalesef izliyoruz bu tabloyu. Bu parçalanmayı her toplumda kendi içinde kutuplaşma olarak ayrıca yaşıyor. Bugünün geçerli siyasal güç anlayışı ne yazık ki uzlaşma ve birleştiricilik yerine çatışma ve kutuplaşmadan besleniyor. Biz de bunu her gün kendi ülkemizde görüyoruz. Yıllar önce iktisatçı Rodrik ortaya koyduğu tezle küresel ekonomi, ulus, devlet ve demokrasi hedeflerinin hepsinin aynı anda gerçekleştirilmesinin mümkün olamayacağını dile getirmişti. Bugün bu tezi doğrularcasına bu hedeflerden en az birini feda etmeye yönelik farklı eğilimler olduğunu dünyanın birçok yerinde görüyoruz. Ve dünya herkesin kendi başının çaresine bakmasını gözeten tek taraflılığa doğru maalesef yöneliyor. Ve kısaca eskiden sadece ikilemde kalır idik, bugün ise dünya sanki üçlemde kalmış gibi gözüküyor. Yani bir sıkışıklık var, sıkışmış durumdayız. Çok değerli konuklar, mevcut durumu daha doğru yorumlamak için dünyanın siyasi ve ekonomik aktörlerine de biraz daha detaylı bakmakta fayda var. Dünya, siyasi ve ekonomik sahnesinin en kuvvetli aktörlerinden şüphesiz Amerika Birleşik Devletleri'nin hegemonyası gerilerken mevcut liberal demokratik sistem bizzat aslında lideri olan Amerika Birleşik Devletleri yönetimi tarafından da sorgulanıyor. Ve bu da transatlantik dünyanın geleceği açısından bir hayli belirsizlik yaratıyor. Bir diğer aktör Avrupa Birliği, evrensel anlamda baktığımız zaman liberal demokratik değerleri, ekonomik bütünleşme ve derinleşmeyi, sosyal refah ve uluslararası barışı üyeleri arasında aslında en iyi sentezleyen oluşum dersek tahmin ediyorum bana katılırsınız. Üstelik çevresine yönelik demokratik dönüştürücü gücü de en büyük artısı olmakta. Ancak onun da kendi mimarisine dönük olarak aşması gereken fevkalade yine ciddi yapısal sorunları var. Önümüzdeki ay TÜSİAD olarak dış politika forumumuzda konuk edeceğimiz Harvard Üniversitesi'nden ünlü siyaset bilimci Yascha Monck'un belirttiği gibi, liberalizmle demokrasinin ayrıştığı bir dünyada, demokratik olmayan, teknokratik bir liberalizmle buna tepki olarak gelişen, liberal olmayan, biraz karışık olmasına rağmen dikkatle bakın, çoğunlukçu ve popülist bir demokrasi anlayışı arasında aslında dünya olarak ve insanlık olarak da fevkalade sıkışmış vaziyetteyiz. Bugün özetle baktığımız zaman birçok şey söyleyebiliriz ama Türkiye'nin bütün dünya aktörleriyle, bütün ülkelerle, dünya liderleriyle ilişkilerini barış ve uzlaşma ortamında ve dostane ilişkilerle yürütmesi gerektiğinin bir kez daha altını çizmek isterim. Çok değerli konuklar, bir başka perspektifi önünüze koymak isterim. Teknoloji açısından da benzer şeyler söyleyebiliriz, değişim anlamında. Dijital teknolojilerin gelişimi de insanların yaşam düzeyini yükseltiyor ve ufkunu genişlettiği zaten aşikar. Ancak diğer yandan siber güvenlik ile ilgili sorunlar, kişisel verilerin dijital ortamda korunması, otoriter sistemlerin gözetim kapasitelerinin demokrasinin sınırlarını aşacak yönde güçlenmesi ya da sosyal medyadaki tırnak arasında yankı odaları yoluyla meydana gelen kutuplaşma ve radikalleşme de yine yeni dönemin artık son derece güncel ve gündemdeki ana sorunları olmuş vaziyette. Çok değerli konuklar, bu sorunların geçici değil, yapısal olduğunu ve çözümün de yerel ve ulusal değil, küresel işbirliğiyle olacağını görmek gerekir. Bu da bence bu gerçeği yok varsaymamak gerek. İş dünyası açısından TÜSİAD'ın da üyesi olduğu Business B20 gibi platformlar bu alanda fevkalade önemli imkanlar taşıyor ki geçen hafta da yine yeni bir B20 deneyimi yaşamış olduk. Serbest ticaret yerine ekonomik korumacılık, özgürlükçü demokrasi yerine siyasal popülizm, kültürel çoğulculuk yerine kültür savaşları. Başta bu politikaları çözüm olarak destekleyenler olmak üzere kimseye yaramayacak ve uzun vadeli durumu maalesef daha da kötüleştirecektir. Yapılacak her hata, inanın bir sonraki hatanın da birisi olmaktadır. Küreselleşmenin kurallı ve denetimli bir şekilde insanlığın önündeki imkan ve özgürlükleri genişletecek bir yönde yönetimi de mutlak zorunluluktur sevgili konuklar. İnsanlığın ve demokrasinin küreselleşmesiyle Küreselleşmenin küreselleşmenin insanileştirilmesinin ve demokratikleştirilmesinin bir arada yürümesi aynı şekilde zorunluluktur. Bunu yapamazsak hem liberalizmi hem de demokrasiyi kaybederek otoriterliğin küreselleşmesine maruz bırakacak bir platform sunacağız yoksa. Türkiye açısından da kurallara dayalı, liberal demokratik bir dünya düzeninin ve diğerlerinin parçası olmak hem dış ilişkilerimiz açısından hem de ekonomik ve demokratik gelişmemiz açısından hayati önemlidir ve bu şekilde altını çizmek isterim. Gerek Batı gerekse Avrupa Birliği ile olan ilişkilerimizin gündelik gelişmelere göre inişli çıkışlı olan yaptığı seyir aslında çok son derece önemli, endişe vericidir. Ve bunu her gün, her saat yaşamaktayız. Bu ilişkilerin uzun vadeli ortak çıkar ve değerler anlayışıyla yürütülmesi, sürdürülmesi ülkemizin geleceği açısından da oldukça önemlidir. Demokrasi, hukuk devleti, kurallara dayalı piyasa ekonomisi ve sosyal kalkınma hedeflerinin başarılabilmesi ve özellikle ekonomimizde son dönemde yaşanan sorunların aşılabilmesi için gerek Batı ile gerekse Avrupa Birliği ile olan ilişkilerimizin daha fazla özen göstermemiz gerektiği de kesindir. Ve ilişkilerde kısa vadeli kayıtsızlık sürerse yerine hepimizin tahmin edeceği gibi daha uzun vadeli ve daha güçlü sorunlara bırakacağı aşikar. Çok değerli konuklar, ekonomimizde şu an yaşamakta olduğumuz sorunlar küresel sorunlardan bağımsız, şüphesiz düşünülemez. Ama bizim de kendimize öncelikle acaba nerede yanlış yapıyoruz, nerede hata yapıyoruz şeklindeki soruyu net olarak sormamız gerekir. Ancak bunu sorarsak bu sorunların üstesinden geleceğimiz de mutlaktır. Geçmiş yıllarda finansal istikrardan ziyade büyümeye yönelik veyahut da öncelik veren politikalar neticesinde kompozisyonunda hata olan büyümeden bahsediyorum şüphesiz. Politikalar neticesinde ekonomimizde fevkalade önemli kırılganlıkları biriktirmiştik. Ve küresel gelişmelerin de etkisiyle bugün bu kırılganlıkların taşımış olduğu risklerin maalesef gerçekleştiğini bütün pazarda ve bütün insanlarımız olarak baş başa kalmış vaziyetteyiz. Ekonomide yaşadığımız bu zorlu dönemin en başından bu yana kamuoyuyla paylaştığımız açıklamalarda bakın 3-4 tane özellikle gerek makro çözüm gerekse bunun altındaki bütün detaylarıyla paylaştığımız şeyleri izin verirseniz çok kısa özetle paylaşmak istiyorum. İlki enflasyon ile mücadele ve kurda istikrarın sağlanması için sıkı para politikasının sürekli uygulanması. İlk ve sürekli söylediğimiz şey buydu. Gerekli mali tasarruf tedbirlerinin alınması, özellikle bankacılık sektörünün aktif kalitesinin bozulmaması için gerekli tedbirlerin alınması ve başta Amerika Birleşik Devletleri ve Avrupa Birliği olmak üzere uluslararası ilişkilerimizin olumlu bir çerçeveye kavuşturulması şeklinde açıklamalarımızı sürekli vurgulamıştık. İnanın içinde bulunduğumuz zorluklar kolay değil aşmak ama emin olun ki zor değil. Şu ana kadar gerçekçi hedefler ve tasarruf tedbirleri içeren yeni ekonomi programını ve Merkez Bankamızın sıkılaşma yönünde atmış olduğu adımları memnuniyetle karşıladık. Bankacılık sistemimizin sağlıklı işlemesi ve karşı karşıya kaldığımız kredi daralmasının reel sektör üzerinde yarattığı olumsuz etkilerin en kısa zamanda aşılması için yeni ekonomik programında bahsi geçen bütün durum analizlerinin bir an önce tamamlanması ve hayata geçirilmesi noktasında gerekli tedbirlerin hızla alınmasını şüphesiz TÜSİAD olarak başta bekliyoruz. Bakın ama bu zorlu dönemde zaman zaman maalesef iş dünyası ile yeterince istişare edilmemiş ve piyasa ekonomisi anlayışıyla ciddi çelişkiler yaratabilecek bazı uygulamalarla da maalesef karşılaştık. Ekonomide sorunlarla mücadele etmek her zaman kolay değildir, zordur. Ancak özellikle böyle dönemlerde kısa vadede çözüm olabilirmiş gibi gözüken, oysa uzun vadede daha büyük sorunlara sebep olacak uygulamalardan da mutlak surette kaçmamız gerekir. Dünyanın hiçbir yerinde sevgili konuklar, fiyat kontrolleri ve benzeri uygulamalardan maalesef başarılı sonuçlar alınmamıştır. Ve tersine bunlar üretime, istihdama ve tüketiciye maalesef olumsuz katkılarda bulunmuştur. Nitekim ülkemizde de geçmişte bu yöntemler denenmiş. Yepyeni bulduğumuz yöntemler değil aslında bunlar ve bunların faydalı olmadığı tecrübe edilmiştir. Bu anlamda gerek enflasyonla mücadelede, gerekse ekonomi için alınacak diğer tedbirlerde iş dünyası ile önceden istişarenin ve her şartta altını çiziyorum, serbest piyasa ilkelerine bağlı kalınmasının çok önemli olduğunu bir kez daha vurgulamak istiyorum. Çok değerli konuklar, hiçbir zorluk kalıcı değildir. Gerçekçi bir iyimserlikle, ilkelerimizden taviz vermeden, akılcı politikalar ile hem küresel düzeyde hem de ülkemizde içinden geçtiğimiz bu zorlu dönemi de aşacağımıza şüphesiz eminiz. Ve dünyanın geleceği ütopyalar ve distopyalar arasında bir yerde gözüktüğü kesin. Kimileri dünyanın geleceği için oldukça iyimser, kimileri de maalesef oldukça kötümser. İyimserlere göre bardağın yarısı hala dolu, kötümserlere göre ise bir hayli boş. İyimser mi, kötümser mi olalım diye bana sorarsanız ben gerçekçi olun tavsiyesinde bulunurum. Biz gerçekçi olalım çünkü bardaktaki suyu emin olun harekete geçen içer. Bugünkü etkinliğimizin çok verimli çıktıları olması temennisini canı gönülden paylaşıyorum. Ve sizlere tekrardan çok teşekkür ediyor ve hepinizi tekrardan şahsım ve TÜSİAD Yönetim Kurulu adına saygı ve sevgiyle selamlıyorum. İyi ki geldiniz. Sağ olun.
Çok teşekkür ederiz Erol Bey. Çok güzel bir ufuk turu oldu ve bugün tartışacağımız konulara da güzel bir temel teşkil etti. Bu noktadan sonra panelimizi İngilizce yürüteceğiz. Ben size paneli tanıştıracağım. From now on we will proceed in English. I'm Kemal Kirişçi, the TÜSİAD Senior Fellow at Brookings, responsible for running the Turkey program. And I'll start with Amanda Sloat on my left. Amanda is a good friend and colleague at Brookings at the Center for United States and Europe. She's the Robert Bosch Fellow and has a very important background experience in the State Department. She was the Deputy Assistant Secretary during the Obama administration, responsible for us, Greece, and Cyprus. She's truly a very good connoisseur of Turkey, Greece, Cyprus, but also Europe at large, and with a particular interest in Britain and the topic of Brexit. She is widely published. I highly recommend you, when you have a chance, to look up Brookings' website, go to experts pages and look up at Amanda's publications. Her most recent publication is a must on Brexit. As you know, this week will be a very heated week on what the future of Brexit is going to be. And then we have Ziya Öniş. I'm sure you're all very familiar with Ziya. We're good friends going back a long time. And Ziya definitely would compete, and Amanda may even go ahead of you in publication terms, more from an academic angle, and holds the pulse of global developments, and actually at Koç University directs a program on global developments. And I would recommend to you his most recent publication from last year, academic publication, The Anxiety Age, was it? I like the title, and I think Erol Bey very much shared the reasons why we are anxious, not just in Turkey, but globally. Constanza Stelzenmüller is also a very good friend and colleague from Brookings, from the same center, and she's the founder of the Robert Bosch Transatlantic Studies program at Brookings. Formerly, she was a journalist with Die Zeit in I'm right, huh? In Germany, but also worked at the German Marshall Fund. And some of you may recall a flagship publication of the German Marshall Fund, which was Transatlantic Trends. And I frankly miss the transatlantic trends. With this publication, they used to hold the pulse of public opinion in the transatlantic community, US, a number of European countries, as well as Turkey, on a wide range of issues. And he used to give us an opportunity to follow the trends in public opinion. Constanza publishes a lot as well. Frequently appears in the Washington Post and Süddeutsche Zeitung, yes. I love German, but I always get nervous that I'm going to mispronounce something along there. And with Constanza, I'm sure she may make references to it. Earlier in the year, she really published a brilliant piece, a report, a brief on normal is over. And that topic, too, converges well with what Erol Bey covered in his remarks. Osman Ulugay, you're very familiar with him. We are very fortunate to have him on the panel, and very fortunate that someone with reason continues to write columns on economic developments. I want to take the opportunity to flag out another columnist of reason, Sami Cohen, our beloved Sami Cohen, and columnist on foreign policy. Osman Bey is not only a columnist, but writes extensively books. And books that I feel Osman Bey straddles well, the world of academia, that Ziya Öniş is to blame for, good academic work, but also, the public, making it easy for the public to follow complicated, difficult issues. And his most recent book, Amanda, it might be of interest to you, is Dünya Trump'a mı kalacak? Each time we have a panel here annually, Osman Bey comes up with a new book. It makes you feel very competitive, there's a lot of competition out there. Yeah, okay.
Now I dare to write such a book.
Yes. What it means is, will the world, how would you say it?
Will it be Trump's world?
Yeah, will it be Trump's world? It's a nice way of putting it. Will it be Trump's? Amanda may not particularly appreciate it. You'll discover it for yourself from her comments. There are different pictures of his mouth around. It takes different forms, interesting forms. But you're absolutely right, because it could get us into dangerous waters. Evren Balta is yet another very good friend and academic who has had an interest in studying political violence, ethnic issues, and citizenship, but with a particular interest in Russia. And although Erol Bey has carefully refrained from mentioning Russia, but at least in Europe and in the United States, there is a lot of concern about Russia's policies with respect to undermining democracy in Europe, but in the United States as well, but undermining the very order that, again, Erol Bey made references to. Evren, welcome. And according to the program I've been given, Evren, I think we're going to start with you. And I would like to, maybe before I give you the floor, to remind you all of the email I sent you, that we will try to keep the initial remarks to 8-9 minutes. We are a crowded panel, and then depending on how the time flows, I may come back to them with another quick round of questions. but we very much want to encourage a lively Q&A. Amanda and Constanza are particularly interested to hear your views as well as your questions. Evren, how do the world that Erol Bey has just described to us look to you from your perspectives? Let's start with you.
Or maybe by looking at the cases of Russia and Turkey, I may try to explain what happened. I mean, I really want to go back a little bit to the 1990s. And it wasn't the best time for Turkey because of not global reasons, but local reasons, the Kurdish conflict, PKK, and this and that. But globally, it was the golden days of liberalism. The world have witnessed in the 1990s, especially in the second half of the 1990s, almost 85, the reform of the 85 authoritarian regimes. 85 authoritarian regimes collapsed anew, and we ended up it was the majority of the countries, maybe in the world's history, was democratic then in the 1990s. But we know what happened afterwards. This optimistic mood had turned into a more pessimistic one like a decade ago, I would say around 2006. But when you look at the data of the Freedom House, the global decline of the democratic freedoms actually started in 2006, not in 2001, but in 2006. And 113 countries had seen a net decline in democratic freedoms. Centralization of power, politicization of the judiciary, attacks on independent media, and we saw the horrible one of those last week as well. We witnessed in Turkey as well, have become really widespread. So the world's order, we know that, is definitely more authoritarian than it was a decade ago, 10 years ago, or 12 years ago. So what happened in these last 10 years? I mean, I'm not really a big fan of Samuel Huntington, but he was right when he argued that democracy comes in waves, and it never is linear, and there is always a backlash. The first wave is, the first backlash is the fascism of the 1930s. The second was the military dictatorships of the 1970s, 1980s, and we witnessed that as well. And we actually are in the period of third backlash, which is characterized by, as Erol Bey was saying, authoritarian populism or competitive authoritarian regimes. But in Huntington's scheme, there was this certain wishful thinking about the future of liberal democracy. He thought that there will be a resurgence of democracy eventually. But now, in these days, I'm not sure whether this time democracy is hollowed out or it has transformed into something dangerous with the rise of the competitive authoritarian regimes. I mean, let me not go any further. We all know what happened. We know that democratic regression is being employed in many parts of the world right now, from Russia to India and to United States as well. But let me go back to my puzzle. What really still puzzles me as a political scientist is this rapid decline. Why this rapid decline? How it happened and why it happened? And I'm going to be very briefly, because I don't have much time, try to explain what happened in Russia and in Turkey, the democratic decline in Russia and Turkey, and the causes of democratic decline in those two countries, which are pretty much similar actually, not just about Turkey. And I think focusing on these two countries is kind of reflective of what's going on elsewhere. And of course, there are a lot of explanations, and we know that the common sense explanation is looking at the leadership, how rulers rule. But let me focus on this. It's neither in Turkey nor in Russia. It's not the rulers, and rulers never rule alone. There are structural reasons why this is happening, and there are competing political coalitions around these leaders. So it's probably the #1 political science rule: no one rules alone, and it's not just the leader. So what happened? I'll be focusing on the structural explanations mostly. The first explanation is actually the most significant feature of our times is the global decline of the appeal of the West. There are many reasons for this, such as the 2008 economic crisis, the US intervention in the Middle East and its subsequent withdrawal, the crisis of Europe, its inability to interact with outsiders, including Russia and Turkey, which became more acute in the mid-2000s, after 2005, I guess, and its failure, Europe's failure to create a stable and durable security order. You can go on, I mean, the list is long, but these problems really became very tense after the 2011 democratic uprisings and their subsequent repression, with increasing opportunities for anti-Westernism among the political entrepreneurs of various sorts. The perceived decline or the real decline of the West has unleashed an intense political conflict or political competition for global and regional influence. And this was the time when the Turkey's political elites began to question whether a Euro-Asianist alliance structure would be a better fit for Turkey. And this trend also intensified with the global or the changing patterns of global inequality, I would say. We have been witnessing decreasing global inequalities among the nations, which is a historical trend, I guess, but an increasing inequality within the countries. So I think this is very crucial to explain what has happened around the world, not just in Russia and Turkey. So most of the world's population made large gains in real income from 1998 to 2008 in 10 years. But the largest gains were made by non-Western countries like China, India, Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, Turkey, and Russia. So these countries ask for more influence in the global affairs, and they become more assertive. And as I said, they now had more opportunities to do that because of the decline of the Western influence globally. And these opportunities are still going on. And in fact, I was reading an op-ed on how Russia is going to use the current crisis between Europe and United States to question the dollar's primacy in economic relations. So it's still going on. This is still going on. Second factor is that starting from 2000s, and especially after 9/11, we witnessed the transformation of the security doctrine everywhere, but mostly in the West. So the exceptional security maybe experienced after the World War II by the Western countries was crucial for the spread of liberal democracy. But I admit that the problems of this destabilizing terrorist acts for the societies, not questioning that, but the way that the Western liberal societies, liberal states responded was even more destabilizing. We experience everywhere in the world the establishment of a form of a security state that rests on emergency powers and almost an arbitrary capacity to define who the terrorist other is. And this really had, the consequences of this transformation for destabilizing the constitutional foundations of liberal democratic regimes is and will continue to act out globally. By making security #1 public issue and by continuously emphasizing the inadequacy of the current regime systems or constitutions or institutions for providing security, this new state form, which really emerged after 9/11, further aggravated the feeling of insecurity and stimulated kind of an authoritarian reflex among the society. So we have a state that provides security more and more, but citizens who feel more anxious and less secure. And it's not really, they really go hand in hand, parallel to each other. Third, we need to add to these explanations the power of war making, especially the Syrian conflict, since its effects are so significant in the whole region. The Syrian civil war, like many other civil wars, had a transnational character, where actors, resources, and events spanned national boundaries. The conflict itself really further unleashed the ambitions of the regional elites in the context of declining power of the West. It allowed both Russia and Turkey to become the patron of significant segments of the Syrian conflict. This is not just the Syrian conflict. You can add Yemen conflict for Saudi Arabia and all these local conflicts where you have patrons states being the patrons of these conflicts, and their system in parallel to their involvement with these conflicts are being transformed to a more authoritarian form. And in fact, in the last decade or so, we were talking about this, not in the last decade, but during the Cold War, we were talking about a military-industrial complex. But nowadays, it really transformed into a criminal military-industrial complex that is involved with war making, and that requires the centralization of authority, more executive power, and immunity. So it really is related how the states really responded or got involved with these conflicts. Finally, maybe, and this is also true for Russia and Turkey as well, being an authoritarian state become costless. How? So as long as the authoritarian leaders has adopted multi-party elections, they have given access to international funds, they have given legitimacy, and this goes on. Doing business with authoritarian leaders irrespective of their human rights record or irrespective of their disengagement has become so widespread. There are many studies showing that political science studies, donors generously reward authoritarian leaders who hold elections but nothing else. So elections really became the yardstick of democracy, and we lost all the other yardsticks of democracy. And if you look at the money really rewards elections, but nothing else. So authoritarian leaders, or domestically, globally, elections have become the only remaining and effective criteria to consider a society democracy. And obviously this really creates a strong interest in many countries in adopting multi-party elections and getting rid of the rest. But not everything is, of course, structural. As I said, all these structural developments or global developments, regional developments have created an intense elite conflict. The scope of which ranges from external alliances to redistribution of resources. And if you have, and historically, and as a political scientist, from Machiavelli to French Revolution to Napoleon Bonaparte, when there is an intense elite conflict and when there is a lot of transformation going on in the global politics, you see a Bonaparte rising. I mean, the elite conflict is usually resolved through transferring all the powers to a single leader. So it's a very historical, I mean, historically, this has been written by the political scientists for centuries. A popular national leader who had legitimacy is given power to resolve these elite conflicts about the alliances, about redistribution of resources, and this and that. Do I have time? Maybe
one additional minute, because
okay.
We don't want to interrupt your line of thinking.
Okay, just one additional note then. What I explained here is occurring both in Russia and Turkey. Well, everything pretty much is happening there. I did not really tell you about what's going on locally. Maybe I can talk about it in the second round. But there are differences as well. And the main difference is, I think, Turkey has followed a populist path to authoritarianism, but Russia has followed a more nationalist path. As when it comes to, for example, democracy, we tend to classify democracies on the basis of how they rule. But when we talk about authoritarian systems, we tend to emphasize who rules, not how they rule. But when you look at Russia and Turkey, you see the way that these regimes rule are completely different. In Turkey, for example, okay, in both countries you have an all-powerful leader, you have a centralized executive, you have an established competitive authoritarian regime. But in Turkey, the populist path to authoritarianism singled out a significant portion of the country, in that almost half of it, 50-50, a lot of polarization going on, as the enemy of people, and creating an intensely polarized and inherently unstable political environment. But when you look at Russia, it did not follow such an anti-establishment. It's anti-Western, but not anti-establishment, and is not as polarized as in Turkey, did not single out a period or history. It's like the Russia in the last 10,000 years. The continuity has been always almost emphasized by Putin. And some of these regimes are inherently conflictual, unstable. I find Turkey's regime more unstable than Russia's regime, and Putin's regime, in terms of that, I mean, in terms of its nationalist emphasis and more inclusive character, can be a more stable authoritarian regime. So the other criteria that we need to look at, the detrimental effects of populism. So authoritarianism we have, but also we need to add the effects of the populist regimes on institutions and the instability. Yes, thanks.
Evren, fascinating, truly fascinating, covering such a wide range of factors that have brought us to the age of anxiety as Ziya. Ziya, would you be able to pick up from where Evren has left and maybe look beyond Turkey and Russia, and maybe relate what she sees for us and Russia to some countries beyond us?
Thank you, Kemal. I would like to continue from where Evren left off. Now we are.
Incidentally, this wasn't planned. It's just the flow. So yeah.
Now we are in the 10th year of the global financial crisis since the collapse of the Lehman Brothers, and I think looking back, it had profound impacts. And I think we can make a distinction between the world of pre-2008 era, the G7 world, a Western-dominated globalization, uniform norms, Washington consensus, perhaps later on post-Washington, modified post-Washington consensus. Now, how do we characterize the world after 10 years? The G20 world, more complex world, where we have emerging powers, both democratic and authoritarian versions of emerging powers. And perhaps we can talk about a mixture of interdependence, fragmentation, and clash of norms, a more complex hybrid norms, where we see clash of norms, perhaps a world of fragmented multilateralism. In that context, I want to focus in the limited time on the rise of China, because the rise of China and also the growing cooperation between Russia and China, but especially on China, and the challenge of Beijing consensus, because one of the major challenges that we observe is involves the competition between three different models of capitalism: Anglo-Saxon, US type capitalism, free market capitalism, the European social market model, and the Chinese style or the Asian style post-developmental state strategic capitalism. Now, when we talk about the challenge of Beijing consensus, I think I want to identify the multiple dimensions of rise of China and the Beijing consensus. One dimension is the benign phase, the soft power based of Beijing consensus. In fact, in some of the conferences, meetings, I've listened to Chinese analysts and scholars, and the way they present Beijing Consensus as an alternative to Western-style capitalism emphasizes the benign face. Soft power, essentially they identify distinct mechanisms like an alternative paradigm. What is the central element of rise of China and Beijing Consensus? A more flexible approach to globalization and development, multipolar world as opposed to Western-dominated world, participating in existing institutions as well as developing new institutions. And when we look at the rise of China, we see both growing role in existing Washington post-Western dominated institutions like IMF, World Bank, WTO, but new institutions. The Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank, the BRICS Development Bank, Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Promoting economic interdependence through direct linkages, trade, foreign investment, and mega projects, the One Belt, One Road project, which will also have profound implications for countries like ourselves. And one of the terms that Chinese scholars typically use is our approach is horizontal, cooperative, win-win, and distinguish themselves from Western approaches, saying that it's a top-down approach based on conditionality. And one of the terms they typically use, for example, in their relations with Africa or One Belt, One Road projects, is no strings attached policies. So the vision of China's growing involvement is an alternative paradigm, a paradigm which emphasizes democratizing globalization, making the globalization process more democratic, more participatory, and that actually unites different BRICS, whether authoritarian or democratic. So this is a more soft power-based approach to globalization. But at the same time, I think we need to look at the other side of the coin, the dark face of the Beijing Consensus. And that here there's both the economic dimension, but more importantly, the political dimension. I think one of the key challenges of the post-2008 global order is the rise of authoritarian state capitalism and challenging the dominant view that capitalism and democracy over time go together. I mean, the established liberal view that there may be periods when there may be conflicts, but in the long term, capitalism and democracy reinforce and go together. What we see in the Chinese context is a model where the domestic regime is very strongly authoritarian, and also in this context we see a lot of collaboration plus conflicts between two authoritarian BRICS, Russia and China. The relationship between Russia and China is a very important relationship which merits a separate relationship. Now you may argue that the approach of China and Russia are different. Russia directly promotes authoritarianism through election meddling, through interventionism. But China also implicitly, through its model of strategic capitalism, serves as an alternative model, and in many contexts the two major powers, one a returning global power, the other emerging global power, tend to reinforce one another. And we also see growing contestation in our region, in the Middle East, in the broader Europe, between core Europe promoting liberal values versus the wider periphery. In fact, I'm now trying to write a paper where I turned it, I try to use the concept of reverse transformation in Europe, where previously the core was instrumental for transforming the periphery, and from which many countries, including Turkey, benefited in the early 2000s. But are we now in a new age where the wider periphery, including illiberal countries of Central Europe, Orban's Hungary, Poland, but also far-right nationalist parties in core liberal states, as well as outside actors, China and Russia, are contesting and trying to shape the future of Europe. So the future of Europe is now very much contested, and this challenge of hybrid norms and the challenge of Beijing or Beijing and Moscow consensus, a controversial term, is very much present in the essential, in the broader European periphery. In terms of, very briefly, I will stop by focusing on some of the elements of how China indirectly promotes authoritarianism. It serves as a role model for many countries, especially for countries with hybrid, illiberal, authoritarian regimes, by serving as a role model, by providing economic incentives, escape routes from, they are no longer as dominant on Western finance or Western financial institutions as in the past. So the Chinese projection of its authoritarian model is more indirect, but at the same time it's a powerful mechanism of serving as a role model and providing a world in which the possibility of successful capitalism can exist without necessarily with democratic values. Recently, I think there are two factors which reinforces this dark side. One is the fact that the regime itself, especially in the period of Xi's presidency, is becoming more authoritarian and personalistic at the same time. So domestically, the regime is more authoritarian. And as China rises globally and becomes more confident, more vigorous and assertive, there is also a growing resentment of any criticism of China's human rights record, of its own domestic politics. So another element I will very briefly focus is challenging this soft power notion of China's rise. You know, their self-projection is horizontal, win-win, cooperative, soft power relationship. But in economic terms also there is a strong element of dependence. There's growing discussion about, for example, One Belt, One Road projects or China's involvement in Africa. New patterns of dependence may be created. They may not involve the traditional IMF or World Bank style conditionality, but new forms of dependence where increasing debts are incurred by countries trying to build these massive infrastructure projects, which may lead to a transfer of assets. So new forms of dependence as well as an authoritarian bias represent, to my mind, the dark phase of the Beijing consensus. Now, perhaps I can come back to this issue in the second round. I want to also briefly discuss some of the future challenges, you know, whether the Beijing consensus will continue, especially the domestic politics and political economy of China. Perhaps I can return in the second round.
Yeah, many thanks, Ziya, truly many thanks. And as the expression goes, you took it out of my mouth, because I was going to go back to Evren and say, if I could call on you, if we have time for the second round, to go back to what Huntington said, the waves. Do you see any prospects of what you just described to us, the trend being reversed in some ways, and us going back to the good 90s and the first half of the 2000s? But Amanda, of course, you know, following the trend of discussion so far, a very critical player in all this is the United States. and this particular personality. How do we weave what's been happening in the US into these trends?
Well, thank you, Kamal. I feel like you could have a future career as a publicist after your very generous introductions of all of us. I thank you to Tusiad for organizing this event, and I think what's a really interesting discussion. I found the title somewhat daunting in thinking about what to say, although several of us enjoyed a lovely utopian weekend in Bodrum, which I have to say was a nice escape from the rather dystopian reality of Washington politics right now. I'm happy to share some thoughts on U.S.-Turkey relations in the question and answer, but we'll focus here as the resident American on the panel on what's happening in my own country, and want to make 5 general points about how I see domestic politics in the U.S. right now and how that's affecting the U.S. position in these debates about the future order. The first point is, I think the best way to characterize American politics right now is extremely polarized. And this is similar, of course, to what's happening in Turkey and in other places. And in particular, we're seeing a large surge in identity politics in the U.S. You're seeing this in debates over Black Lives Matter. You're seeing this play out in the gender movement with Me Too. And you're seeing very partisan, zero-sum approach to politics. You actually have members of Congress saying that there's really no point in working across the aisle because bipartisanship doesn't pay off. And even on issues like looking at the Russian hacking of the U.S. election is become seen through a very partisan lens. The Democrats are quite concerned about issues of collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russians. And then there's also a separate issue on national security grounds about potential Russian interference in the election, which Republicans have been less willing to investigate because they feel like it's the Democrats trying to undermine the legitimacy of the Trump administration. So really on any issue that comes up, you know, Kavanaugh hearing, same thing. Everybody ends up falling into one or the other camps. And there isn't a lot of movement between the two sides. Second general point is it's very easy to think of this in the singular personality of Trump, but this really is not about Trump. I would say that he's a symptom of this rather than the cause of what's happening. There had been growing polarization in the United States in recent years. Even if Hillary Clinton had been elected president, you wouldn't necessarily see some of what I consider to be the damaging policies of Trump, but you still would have the same social polarization within the country. The challenge, I think, for those of us that believe in the liberal international order and some of these more liberal values is that Trump's rhetoric is resonating across the country. So I think he was picking up on concerns that people already had within Middle America and elsewhere and is further polarizing this. Some of his rhetoric is allowing people to express things that they might not otherwise have. We had not been seeing large neo-Nazi marches, for example, in the United States. You're now seeing opinion polls suggesting that there is growing skepticism about NATO in the United States. You could argue that there had been tendencies towards some U.S. isolationism, some retrenchment. Obama certainly chose not to get involved actively in the war in Syria after a lot of American fatigue through wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. There was frustration in Europe when Obama talked about the pivot to Asia and moving away from Europe. But you're seeing an escalation of this with a lot of what Trump is doing. I think there also is a genuine sense across the United States that they feel like the global burden has been unfair. And that's resonating in a lot of these debates about NATO defense spending. I think Trump has put this in a very narrowly focused way in terms of talking about the 2%. But certainly if you talk with people in Middle America, there are questions about why the United States should be bearing the burden of spending, bearing the burden of defending Europe, expected to serve as the world's policeman to come in and do things. Third point is that this is not simply happening in the U.S., and I think Evren gave a very good overview of how some of these trends are happening in places like Turkey, like happening in Russia. Constanza, I know, is going to talk about what we're seeing in Europe, but you're certainly seeing a lot of similar trends that are motivating some of these feelings in terms of fear of migration, people not doing as well economically, concerns that globalization is not necessarily working for everybody. This is playing out in Brexit. We're seeing the rise of far-right parties and populist governments elsewhere in Europe. I think the thing that's been striking for many Americans is there, of course, has been this long belief in American exceptionalism. So if there's anything exceptional for many, it's that we are not immune from these forces and that similar things are happening here. As one that's watched Turkey for a long time, it's also been interesting to watch some of the challenges that we're seeing to American institutions, with President Trump criticizing the free press and talking about removing the media license from NBC News, with President Trump attacking judges whose decisions he doesn't like. We even saw President Trump criticizing the Federal Reserve for wanting to raise interest rates. So there are some things that are happening in Washington that are oddly reminiscent of conversations that have been happening in Turkey. I think one of the big differences that we're seeing in the U.S. is that so far our political institutions have been strong and they've been resilient, and the press has been fighting back. Congress, somewhat less than I would have hoped, is pushing back. But institutions get tired, and we're even only 2 years into the Trump administration and already seeing a certain amount of fatigue among some of these institutions. Fourth point, what does the future of this mean for U.S. politics? Certainly all eyes are going to be on the midterm elections that we have in Washington in 2 weeks. Current wisdom is that the Democrats are likely to take the House. It's quite typical in midterm elections that the governing president loses at least one of the bodies in Congress, and opinion polls are suggesting that the Democrats are likely to win the House. It is much less likely for them to win the Senate, partly because a lot of the seats that are up are seats that Democrats need to hold. So there's fewer opportunities for them to take additional seats. Certainly the big question is going to be turnout. Turnout tends to be low in midterm elections, but we are also seeing people quite energized on both sides. And so I think this really is going to be a numbers game in terms of who can actually get their people to turn out. Certainly for those on the Democratic side, there is a hope that the Democrats take at least one of the branches in Congress. My concern is that this could end up leading to additional polarization in the American political debate. There's going to be incredible political pressure on the Democrats if they take control of Congress to engage in very rigorous oversight. There's people talking about impeachment hearings for Trump. There's people talking about impeachment hearings for Kavanaugh. And the danger is if the Democrats are not seen as coming forward with viable policy alternatives, but simply in an attacking position, it's going to make it much easier for Trump to run against that record 2 years from now. And I actually think if the American economy continues to do well, that it's quite likely that Trump gets reelected in 2 years. So then we're not simply looking at 4 years of this, but we are looking at 8 years of this. There's been a lot that's been discussed over the last year about this idea of the adults in the room, the question of whether there's a moderating influence on Trump. I think many of the final adults who have been in the room are beginning to leave the room. You know, we now have Bolton in the National Security Council. We have Pompeo at the State Department, who, as a former State Department official, I think has been better for morale in the State Department than Tillerson was, but certainly has much more hawkish views than his predecessor did. Nikki Haley is going to be leaving the UN at the end of the year. And there's also increasing speculation that Defense Secretary Mattis is going to be leaving the administration soon as well, not helped by Trump over the weekend, suggesting that he was basically a Democrat, which sounds like a good way to yes, that was not, I don't think, meant in a complimentary way. There's been a lot of debate over the last year as well about whether or not what the president says actually matters. I think if you had a Republican on the panel, the argument that they tend to put forward is not to pay attention to the president's rhetoric, but to look at the policies and what's actually happening. I disagree with this. I think words matter. I think when you start telling people that the words of the American president aren't meaningful, it not only undermines the integrity of the office, but it sends a very dangerous message to the world about what the president is actually saying. So I think rhetoric matters, and certainly actions matter. I also think it's a mistake to believe that we simply are going to bounce back from all of this in 2 years or in 6 years. I really worry that fundamental damage is being done to the transatlantic relationship, and I think a lot of what the president has said and done has been corrosive to the bonds that hold us together in the transatlantic relationship. When you are starting to refer to the EU as a foe, when you are questioning whether the U.S. is going to come to the defense of fellow NATO allies, it's corrosive to the trust that holds together the relationship. Final point then, which I've started moving into, is what does this mean for the future of the transatlantic relationship and also fellow defenders of the liberal international order? One I already mentioned, which is I think the damage and the danger of questioning these institutions. We already have a lot of citizens, we have populist parties questioning the utility of the European Union and NATO, and it certainly does not help when we have leaders who are actively undermining these institutions. Relatedly, I think there's also a dangerous questioning of values that's taking place. Certainly in policymaking, there's always a tension between your interests and your values, but I think the current administration has been moving the United States away from a defense of values, particularly human rights and rule of law. And you've seen this in Trump's response to Russian election interference, and you also saw it in the last day or two with his response to accusations of the Saudi killing of Khashoggi in the consulate here in Istanbul, where he used essentially the same language in both cases to repeat the strong denials of the leaders and suggest alternative forces as being responsible for these things. Lots of discussion, and I know this will segue into what Constanze is going to be talking about in terms of what does an America First policy actually mean. Lots of people questioning whether America First ultimately means America alone. And we're starting to see divergence from America's European allies on an increasing number of policy issues. The issue of Iran, the issue of climate change, and even the issue of the Khashoggi case with Germany, France, and the UK putting out a very strong statement earlier this week, and then Trump's comments suggesting much more ambivalence about this. Also raising questions in Washington about whether we're going to see some sort of European strategic autonomy developing in response to this, and whether or not that's ultimately going to be a positive thing for the United States. Final thought is I think the challenge all of us face who care about the liberal order and want to defend the liberal order is finding both ways to continue to defend its importance, but I think at the same time there also needs to be a recognition that citizens have very legitimate concerns about some of the ways in which it has not necessarily been meeting their interests in terms of political legitimacy and in terms of economic order. So the challenge for all of us is both defending institutions that we value and care about, and at the same time trying to find ways of making meaningful reforms to make them work for our citizens more effectively.
I forgot to warn you that Amanda delivers fascinating substance, but at the rate of a machine gun, and following, absorbing, let alone taking notes is a real challenge. Well done, Amanda. I'm sure so far we have been we've been at the receiving end of a lot of stuff to discuss, but I'd like to finally turn to Osman Bey and seek maybe a resume of all this from your perspective, coming on the heels of your book. Do we blame it all on Trump, or there's something broader that's going on up there?
Thank you. I was trying to concentrate on from utopia to dystopia issue, which was in
Very
the
good.
title, and which looked to me to be a very interesting topic for discussion. And to answer your question first, it is not about Trump at all. I mean, it's something much wider. And we have to see it in this perspective in order to understand why we are here at this moment. And while we are discussing this issue, I feel that we have to state at the beginning that this issue is actually an issue of the Western world. It is not exactly a global issue, but it has much more emphasis on being an issue of the Western world. Because let's take it from the end of history utopia that was publicized after the end of the Cold War. It was actually, you know, it appeared in an article by Francis Fukuyama, but then it was embraced generally in the West. And it was supposed to produce a new world order. And within that new world order, we would be entering a new period in human history where the emphasis would be on economic development, capitalist transformation, and what would follow immediately would be the embracement of the Western type of the democracy, the liberal democracy. So this was a grand project which was embraced after the Cold War was seen as a victory for the West. And now when we look from the perspective of where we are today, we have to see what happened to this project and why we are here today. At the outset, I must say that it was a Western project led by the Western establishment, but when we look at it today, we clearly see that the West is unable to lead and to manage this project. So as a result, we don't have a new world order, but a world totally out of control. A world of disorder, much more than a world of order. Now, what was the original project? If we just look at it very briefly, first of all, it was a globalization of capitalism. We have to put it very clearly that the West, the heart of the project was the globalization of capitalism. And that part of the project, eventually, we now see that was a huge success. We have to accept that it was a huge success because when we look at it from the point of view of the world as a whole, at least half of the world's population has benefited from this transformation in an unprecedented type of transformation. It was a huge transformation where China, if we take China as an example, was transformed from a rural society into an industrial society, now competing with America, not just in terms of total output or GNP, but also in the highest technology. So that is a huge transformation which affected the lives of more than half of the world's population. So this is definitely a success story from this aspect, and we have to see it like that. But what happened as a consequence of that? The global balance of power has changed dramatically. And this is one item, one aspect of this transformation, is that the West is reluctant to accept this as a fact of this transformation. It still pretends to be the leader of the world, as if it is still commanding with the same resources and the same authority as it was 30 years ago, but it is in fact not like that. So the global balance of power in terms of economic terms has shifted. More than half of global GNP now is created in the non-Western world. But this was accompanied by something else, and this was the technology revolution, which was accompanying globalization. So we have to see the two together, and the creative effects, but also we have to see the disruptive effects. I think this word disruption is the key word which explains what has been going on in the last 30 years. You know, this idea of disruption is mainly embraced by the technology industry. The more you disrupt, the more you're successful. And look at Amazon, for example, as the main example of successful disruption. And now Amazon's owner, Jeff Bezos, is the richest man in the world. He just became the richest man in the world in 5 years. I mean, could that be possible in any other time in human history?
Osman Bey, just to intervene, can you open up a little bit what you mean with disruption?
Disruption.
With technological disruption.
Yeah. Disruption, actually, I tried to find a word for it in Turkish. I couldn't. You have to use several words to me.
We are immune to disruption. That's why, probably.
But it actually means that you have to change the existing technology or existing way of doing things radically, so that with this new when you disrupt the old technology, then you can replace it with your own innovation. Yeah. But of course, the word disruption implies something much more than just that. So I don't want to spend too much time on it. But incidentally, when I was looking at this word, I found out that I remembered actually that the same Fukuyama published a book in the year 2000, which was called The Great Disruption. And it was explaining the unraveling of American society. So he used the word disruption in this meaning. So, and therefore, I think this word disruption must be kept in our minds as a phenomenon that explains much of which that happened. And when you take it from that point of view and remember all the developments that took place as a result of globalization and the digital revolution, the technological revolution, we must admit that we have been going through a huge not just economic transformation, but also technological transformation, and we have entered an entirely new world I would say, which has actually perhaps changed the human condition. I would go as far as that, because just to put it very simply, a person owning an iPhone is not the same person as before. I mean, owning an iPhone means so many things, and is such a transformation in one's life that we can just accept it as a new gadget. I mean, it's something much more than that. But as a result of all this, what happened was several things happened. One was, as I told you, the economic transformation and the change of balance of power. But accompanying this, and as a as a result of this disruptionary transformation, there was an explosion in inequality, as Evren mentioned. Actually, as this rebalancing in the world economy took place, the inequality between the West and the rest narrowed. There's much less, now they are competing on a more equal basis, but equality within the countries, and this includes China and the other newcomers, there was a huge explosion in inequality. And this is also related to the developments in technology. Because with these new, opportunities that the new technologies create, you can, without starting with a certain monetary capital, you can become the richest man in the world in 5 years or 10 years. I mean, when there is this opportunity, then of course there is a great possibility for increasing inequalities. And as a follow-up from this, this development, we now have a new global elite, which has become the target of the populist reaction. And it is as if the world now is divided very generally into two categories. One is the new global elite, which includes people from all areas, but they are the ones that are determining many decisions and holding control in this way or another, and the rest. And the rest is now showing a reaction to this, because the present institutions and the present setup of the world economy and the present the present operation of the world capitalist system doesn't satisfy their demands. And mainly now speaking about the Western world again. And I think this is the major issue lying behind the reaction that is now developing in America and in the other Western countries. This contradiction between the new global elite and the old middle class of the Western world, and this brings up the necessity of thinking the whole thing over, whether we need a reform also in the nature of capitalism. And this is a discussion which is now extending the limits of discussion within the Marxist or leftist communities, and is gaining ground within the business community and within the intellectual circles who are closely related with the business community. For example, this year I've been attending the Financial Times Weekend Festival in September in London for the second time, and this year there was a heavy emphasis on how capitalism should be reformed to be more inclusive and to meet the needs of a wider section of the population. And celebrated writers like Martin Wolf, for example, was one of the strong defenders of this idea. And 4 or 5 years ago, no one would expect Martin Wolf to come to this point. So, not to keep it too long, I think there is today a need to have a global view to reform or to change many aspects of the present working in the global system. And there is a definite need for a new social contract, especially in Western societies, so that this polarization can be somehow dealt with, and the international repercussions of this of this polarization can be reduced, because if we leave it as it is, I fear there is the danger of going towards much wider global conflicts, which might eventually lead to armed conflicts because of these the type of the personalistic leaders that we are now living with. I mean, one fears that in a moment of desperation or something like that, Mr. Trump or one of the others can take such a decision that it will be irreversible, and you can't do something about it. And in this endeavor, I think the United States again has a very special mission, because it appears that although China is a rising power, it is much behind the United States in terms of imposing its soft power on the world and being credible about that. So, and the other day I read an article in Foreign Affairs advocating that the G9 should be taking over from America the leadership of the Western world and that type of thing. But I don't give much credibility to that type of argument. It will fall on the U.S. eventually, and of course the domestic politics of the U.S. and the resistance that they are that is being shown to what Trump is trying to achieve, I think is a very interesting starting point. So I still have hopes that the United States will, which was at the outset the reason why this project didn't evolve as it should, now can play a role to reverse its original sin, let me say.
Thank you. Thank you. This is absolutely great, but I'm in a state of panic for two reasons. Time has flown by, and somehow I disrupted the order of the speakers here. Constanza, No. I don't want you to stick to 2 minutes, but try to make it in the 8-10 minutes we had originally allocated, because in a way I agree with what just Osman Bey said in his concluding remark, which also reminded me of a very good friend and colleague we have at Brookings, who has just published a book called The Jungle Grows Back, Robert Kagan, and he's advocating what you've just pointed out, Osman Bey, saying that the natural nature of the human being is not to live in the kind of order we lived since the Second World War, and is referred to often as the US-led rule-based order, and that if the US fails to play that role, the jungle, the IVs and the weeds will grow back and take us back to the natural state of orders like it was the case before the Second World War. And in that context, of course, Europe is very critical as well, because that rule-based order was product as much of the US as it was also of Western Europe. And Constanza, where do we stand in that respect?
All right, well, thank you very much. It's quite difficult after these four really interesting, very thought-provoking presentations to come in at the end and offer anything new. Who was it who said that they felt like Elizabeth Taylor's eighth husband? It was hard to, provide any novelty to the experience. Well, that's me. Anyway, I've just compared you to Elizabeth Taylor, so there. I want to start out with what I think is happening in the US. There will be a little bit of overlap between me and Amanda, because that is I think, in the perfect storm that Europe is experiencing right now. The sort of key new element is the US not just apparently abdicating from its role as a guarantor, as a steward of the international order, but in fact attempting to undermine it. And if you think that Amanda can talk fast, I can do that too. But if I reach sort of supersonic levels, just wave at me, and I will try to slow down again. I have a habit of doing this, including in my native language, which is German. Now, yes, we were talking about the US under Trump, about the blistering rhetoric, the zero-sum competition framing that this administration has given itself, its hostility to multilateralism, globalization, and indeed the EU, but that the theory in the first year was really, oh, this will all be contained by the adults in the room. They're taking care of things. Kemal kindly referred to an analytical essay that I wrote in February, which I called Normal is Over, where I suggested that this was unlikely to remain the case, because what we were really seeing was a very fundamental disruption, and that Europeans were not paying attention enough, in particular to the hostility of this administration towards not just individual European nations such as Germany, and that has been a distinct feature of this administration, somewhat disconcerting for a German living in Washington like me, but a sort of narrative of the European project that is uniquely hostile compared to previous administrations. There has always been criticism of Europe and of European failure to share in the burden of transatlantic relations, much of which I subscribe to, but this is different. This is a genuinely this is the first administration in the White House and the first president who has not just questioned the validity of the liberal international order as such and the need for an American stewardship of it, but the validity of the European project. And what the framing that I deployed in my paper was what I call the triple war narrative: trade wars, culture wars, and actual wars. And we were wondering at the end of that first year whether any of that was going to come to pass or whether it would just stay rhetoric. And it seems to me that what we have seen in this second year is the rhetoric indeed becoming reality. We've seen the cancellation of the JCPOA, the Iran agreement by America. We've seen tariffs on the EU and China. And we saw this extraordinary sequence of disruptive appearances by this president between the G7, the Singapore summit, the NATO summit in Brussels, where Amanda and I were together, which was really quite exhausting, and then finally the Helsinki summit, where the president was alone with Putin, and we still don't know what they discussed. Now, interestingly, of my three sort of war scenarios, the one that actually hasn't happened is actual wars, which is not what we expected, because I think particularly when Trump exchanged McMaster for Bolton and Tillerson for Pompeo, we thought that this might actually lead to the formation of a war cabinet and perhaps some sort of military strikes against North Korea and or Iran. At least that was something that people were discussing in Washington. But what we're seeing, in fact, is Bolton and Pompeo very carefully focusing on other things. Bolton gave his first speech as National Security Advisor at the Federalist Society and talked at length about the evilness of the International Criminal Court. which for a national security advisor of the United States in the current situation was a very, very strange, and I would argue, and in fact have argued, irresponsible thing for him to do. Pompeo, similarly, appears to be, in his speeches, kicking the can down the road. He has said that we will resolve the North Korea issue by 2020, 2021. That presumably means when Pompeo no longer is the Secretary of State. Instead of which, however, we have had something that is very definitely a trade war in the form of the imposition of tariffs and of sanctions, and not just against regimes that this administration considers adversarial, but also with regard to allies like the EU. There has been, apart from the tariffs, there also a quite, shall we say, athletic deployment of sanctions against North Korea, against Iran, against Russia, and against Turkey, of course. And the Germans, in fact, are still waiting for sanctions against Nord Stream 2. There is a distinct possibility of that, and I don't care to think what will happen in Europe and in Germany if that does happen. And if I had to sort of describe the overall effect of this economic coercion, I would say it's seeking very short-term impact, the short-circuiting of normal diplomatic process for swift results. In the case of Iran, certainly, it's been made very clear by Pompeo, for example, that what the regime is what the American administration is ultimately seeking is a regime change in Tehran. But there appears in none of these cases, whether with regard to Russia, whether with regard to Turkey, to North Korea, or Iran, a clear endgame. Much of what is happening appears to be instead capricious and arbitrary, and with apparent complete disregard for the secondary impact of these activities on allies like the Europeans or the Japanese or the South Koreans. What this does, of course, is this undermines institutions like the WTO. It's not clear to me, in fact, whether this administration wouldn't be quite keen on dismantling the WTO as yet another nefarious multinational institution. And of course it undermines trust. It undermines trust particularly with traditional allies in Asia and in Europe. The second element, or the second framework, the culture wars, has also come to pass. In fact, the one point on which this president has never, ever reversed himself is in his liking for authoritarian rulers. And I'm not just talking about Xi Jinping or about Vladimir Putin, or for that matter, Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines, all of whom he has praised fulsomely, but in his admiration for, his praise of European authoritarians, where we're getting a little closer to home for us and a little closer to the problems. We know of his relationship with Erdogan, but he's also praised the Hungarian Prime Minister Orban. He's praised the Italian new government, which is de facto run by the minority party, the Lega, and by the Interior Minister Salvini. And he gave a very complimentary speech in Warsaw, praising the new Polish, the peace government. And of course, the Austrians have also gained with their, where you have a center-right party in coalition with a far-right party, the FPÖ, have also gained a lot of traction and praise in Washington. The Hungarians used not to get meetings at all in Washington. They are now, I think, the most favored European country in Washington. At least that's what it seems like, which is extraordinary if any of you have ever paid any close attention to what Orban has been doing in his country. He has been basically reconstructing constitutionalism in such a way as to maintain Fidesz in power forever. But the real problem is not this president's abdication or this president's preference for authoritarian rulers. The real problem is that these rulers, and particularly the ones in Europe, appear to feel encouraged and enabled by him in a project that goes far beyond what we thought was their maximum ambition, which is rebuilding their own internal orders, we're now seeing Orban, the Austrians, Salvini, and supported by Bannon, and with applause from the French far right, trying to create a movement, an European league of leagues, as it were, to capture, in the European elections, to capture the European Parliament, and through the Parliament capture the European Commission, thereby the institutions. And this is a completely new development in European populism. Previously, the European populists were just critiquing, and with some good reasons, establishment policies. What we have now is European populists with support from the American alt-right, presenting an alternative vision of the European project and an alternative vision of the West, and proposing to put it into power. That's a new quality. And I never thought I would see a day when an American president would be seen to be obviously supporting this. So there you are. The counter-arguments against this have, as some of us have already said, have been, but the professionals will maintain control of this. I would say to you, the professionals in Washington are exhibiting every sign of sort of quite deliberately ignoring this, the deleterious aspect of trade coercion on the alliance, or the authoritarian preferences of the president on the health of the European project. It isn't helpful when the head of European policy in the State Department says he has nothing to warn the Poles or the Hungarians about the way they manage their internal affairs, or when he says that trade is not the State Department's business. I would say when it starts undermining European order, it absolutely is. Finally, I think it's an illusion to assume that we can preserve security cooperation, and that, I suppose, is a Turkish concern as well, from the toxic impact of trade wars and culture wars. We're already seeing the tribalization, the balkanization of intelligence sharing in NATO. And we are seeing, I think, a huge risk of the accidental escalation of conflict and friction arising out of the reckless rhetoric of this administration and of the European populists. And that, I think, ought to be a concern for us in the alliance as well. Now, the European reactions to this have been not very organized, because most of us, including Germany, and you will have seen the reports about the Bavarian elections this Sunday, most of us appear to be more and more inward-looking, more and more concerned with the functioning or the non-functioning of our own internal affairs and our own populist challenges in our own orders. But in this situation for Europe, where we are seeing a concatenation of threats like we haven't seen in 30 years, with populists at home, with the potential for a resurgence of the Eurozone crisis if the Italian economy goes bust because of the recklessness of Italian monetary policy. We're seeing a migration crisis that is held at bay by the deals that we have made, including with Turkey, but that if there is a resurgence of conflict in the Middle East, in Syria, or a regime change in Iran, or a variety of other forms of conflict that we can all imagine, then that will have an immediate impact on Europe, as we all know. Mm-hmm. We have Russia and China, some of you have already mentioned this, becoming European powers, meddling in the European project in ways that are both forceful and malignant. The Russian version of this is a little more destructive than the Chinese, because the Chinese need a functioning European infrastructure and a functioning European single market for their purposes, and aren't quite as concerned about Europe presenting a sort of positive alternate vision to the Russian social system. And on top of all that, we now have a United States that is hostile to the European project. Or at least, let me be precise, I don't think all Americans are hostile. I don't think all American politicians are hostile. In fact, I believe we have many allies in America still, and many Democrats in America who are horrified by all this. But we have, for the first time in history, an American administration that is hostile to the European project. And that, it seems to me, is the kind of strategic challenge that Europe has never seen before. I haven't seen it in my lifetime, in my 20, 25 years of analyzing and writing about these issues. And to be honest with you, I'm not entirely sure that we're going to pass this test. Some days I think so, other days I'm deeply pessimistic. I will say, though, that this is no longer a debate in Europe about whether we need to integrate more or whether we need to enlarge more. It's no longer just a debate about the North versus the South or the East versus the West or about different threat perceptions. It is a debate about how to constitute ourselves internally and what that means for the legitimacy of it. Protection of minorities against the tyranny of the majority. And only that will enable us to be effective and legitimate as actors, both in Europe and the European periphery and abroad as Europeans. Now that may mean that we have to rethink our relationship with authoritarian powers, not just abroad. That means Germany reconsidering its relationship perhaps with not just Russia but China. It also forces us to reconsider our relationship, perhaps with Erdogan's Turkey, and with Orban's Hungary, and with Kaczynski's Poland. Now, I think there are important differences here, and in particular, I would say in Turkey and in Poland, there are vibrant civil societies that disagree with where their rulers are taking their countries, which leaves us some hope for these relationships. Also, we have a very large German-Turkish population in my country. And by the way, not just in Germany, but in the Netherlands and Belgium as well. But the biggest one, of course, is in Germany. And that, I think, those are ties that bind us to you. That Turkish population, your civil society, in ways that I think can make us weather these storms. But for a country that goes full authoritarian, like Hungary, I don't know how we work with it in the EU, and I don't know how we work with it in NATO. Now, it's very difficult to throw countries out of the EU, and it's, the NATO treaty doesn't provide for throwing countries out of NATO. But I think that we will see these countries becoming progressively isolated in these unions, and that there may be a, shall we say, a parting of ways without an institutional separation. I find this an anguishing prospect. I find this a profoundly unhappy outlook. And it's already a more positive outlook because it's one where the democratic nations in Europe band together and try and reach out to those of its partners where we have ties that bind us and where we think the country hasn't completely flipped. But I think it's going to make our politics become chaotic. It's going to make our foreign and security policies become chaotic and difficult to manage. And I can only wish all of us good luck as we try to weather this together. I don't see a clear path through this storm, but I do think that we have to do it, because if we don't manage it, the world is going to look a lot more like the world that my parents were children in, which was the post-war period. And I don't want to experience what they experienced before that, which was World War II, and which was a disaster for the entirety of the continent. So I think the stakes for us are pretty high for getting it right and for working together to prevent the worst. But I think the worst, what's possible as the worst now is something far bigger and far more awful than we have been able to contemplate for decades. And there we are. Thank you.
Well, Constanze, you've really left us in a very upbeat, happy, optimistic
yes, and it wasn't 8 minutes either. I apologize. I got carried away.
But there it is. The picture that Constanze has drawn is part of that reality out there, and kind of rhymed as well with the concluding remarks of Osman Bey. Time has flown by, but the organizers have assured me that if there's interest, we can stay on a bit more. rather than go for the second round and address the question that I had in mind, which Evren had provoked about Huntington's views of waves and whether we can pick this up again, I'd like to turn to you and take in the first round at least a good 2-3 questions, a turn for a quick response, and hopefully we can have a very quick second round as well. I will spare you my perspective on these issues. Yes, please. If you could mention your name and also take a microphone. 4545.
Thank you. My name is Murat Gülkan. I work in the finance industry. If I may pick on what I perceive to be a common thread between something Evren Balta said and Ziya Bey touched upon. So Dr. Balta laments the fact that running an authoritarian regime has become a cost-free undertaking and that markets no longer penalize such regimes and in many cases, in fact, reward them. And Ziya Bey noted that the main alternative to this order, the Beijing consensus, also prides itself on its no-strings-attached approach. So the question that arises, I think, is then upon whom does it fall to protect liberal democracy? If it's not the capitalist order, if it's not the Beijing consensus, then what's the carrot or what's the stick to stand against what probably is a wave of some sorts? Is it perhaps greater engagement with civil society that Constance touched upon? I mean, what's the answer? What's the solution to try and stand against this wave?
Thank you. Yes, please.
Hey, so my name is Hugo de Benoit. I'm an intern for the Friedrich Naumann Foundation in Istanbul. And I would like to thank all of the panelists. And I have a question for Frau Stelzenmüller. About the balkanization of the trade information in NATO, if I noted correctly.
Of intelligence.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate more on that?
Sure.
Thank you. Very specific question. Yes.
Thank you. I think that most of the panelists, my name is Faruk Bil. I'm at Yeditepe University of Yeditepe. Disruption was the major issue that we have been talking from different angles, and a return to natural order, as you said, which is the worst that can happen to mankind. That everybody turns to wolves, and I was wondering if we could name this this fluctuation, this cycles, as a result of a continuous disruptive situation where people are living in a continuous derivatives, not in a continuous path of mode of life, but has to change quite often with crisis of failures on the beliefs and, for instance, failure of free market, the free hand, and the balance of power, and the rise of esoteric powers in the balance of power in international politics, increase of population, diminishing resources, and also men starting to walk hands down and talk with long distance while walking on the sideways. The fear of this continuous change, my first question. My second, if we could link this to another fear that we haven't talked here, which is, as Christine Lagarde said, we will all be like roasted chickens if we continue this way. Climate change and sustainability. Can this issue, climate change and sustainability, balance the other side of the populist rhetoric with another inspiring rhetoric in the democracy for democracy? Thank you.
Thank you. The person behind you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, I'll take you to, and maybe one more question very quickly. Go ahead.
Yeah. Ole Frahm, University of St. Gallen in Switzerland. I just have a short comment that's more generally directed. I felt like I'm very sympathetic to the general assessment of the crisis of liberal democracy in different parts of the world. But then I think this applies both to Zia Önüş and to Constanze Stelzenmüller. Isn't there also a fear of a threat of overstating the threat of collusion between the different authoritarian actors, in the sense that it's almost constructing a Wizard of Oz, that there is a socialist international, there's a liberal institutionalized world order, but there isn't really a proper collusion of interest among the different actors, even though there's such a major focus on Steve Bannon's Tour d'Europe and partly coming back to Evan Balter's point, there's also very little cooperation between, say, Russia and China in trying to have any kind of institutionalized soft power. And the same, I think, applies also for the Eurasian Union, the Shanghai Five. All these institutions have very little to act against the liberal institutions. Yeah,
very good one. Refik, yeah, next to you, please, and we'll turn to the panel.
Refik Erzan, Boğaziçi University. We talked about the U.S. and President Trump, but a closer example is Britain, actually, the Brexit thing. And to me, that's a litmus test for the short run. How will Britain will pass that exam? Now, the date is March 2019. Economically speaking, it's a total disaster. Most economists would agree, Brexit. But politically, how will Britain deal with that? Out of this chaos, whether they manage the Brexit or not, how will they emerge from this mess, the British democracy? Economics can be sort of sorted out, but how will Britain come out of this? And I heard that Amanda is an expert on Brexit. Particularly, I would like to hear your opinion. Thank you.
We'll make sure of that. Yeah. Thank you. Let me turn to the panel. Time is limited. There's a really fascinating range of questions. I'm not very sure how I should. Why don't we start with you, Constanza? That'll be easier. It'll give me a moment to organize these things.
The intelligence. On the balkanization of intelligence in NATO, it's I don't work at NATO, but from what I hear, countries with problematic governance are being excluded out of certain conversations, and that I think includes this country. Yeah. The Austrians are members of the Partnership for Peace, not members of NATO, but they're sort of closely working with NATO. And in Austria, the Interior Ministry, which is under FPÖ governance, recently raided its own domestic intelligence agency at night. Ever since then, they've been frozen out of conversations as well. That was reported in the New York Times. Now, on the question of the right-wingers working together or not, the risk of overstating them, I can entirely agree with you. I think that there is so much parochial disagreement between, I mean, if you look at Orban and Salvini's positions on migration policy, that alone would be enough to preclude them working together. That may be true, but I wouldn't underestimate their energy, and I wouldn't underestimate the degree to which they have an impact in public perception because of the defensiveness of the establishment parties in Europe, And I also wouldn't underestimate the degree to which they, even if they don't capture the European Parliament or the European institutions, they can still have real blocking or spoiler capabilities if they have a smaller impact. And that I think we ought to take very seriously. I certainly don't think we should ignore them. I do not think very highly of Steve Bannon's abilities to organize anything. So that to me is the least of my concerns. But I am much more worried about the endogenous European capability to organize. And finally, the question that you had asked about who needs to act. I have 3 points here. One, I think civil society needs to ask itself, are we doing enough? Are we mobilized enough? Are we active enough? And are we loud enough in making clear that we want a different kind of governance? I appreciate how difficult this is in situations where government has the police power. But I think that civil societies are stronger than they think and have a greater role to play. I think the second group that has more responsibility than anybody else is centrist parties, center-right parties in particular, which need to distance themselves from the authoritarian right. In some ways, and including in my country, those same parties have tried to imitate them, like the CSU, which got hammered in yesterday's elections, tried to imitate the AfD and got hammered for that in the polls. And finally, there is also responsibility for those working in authoritarian regimes and enabling them while hoping to prevent the worst. I appreciate all civil servants who work in such a regime with the intention of preventing an authoritarian in power from pursuing his worst objects. But I think that these people in particular, these civil servants in particular, have to ask themselves every day whether they've reached the point where they're not actually enabling that person. So those are my 3 groups that I think need to look at what they're doing.
So you're encouraging them to write anonymous
No,
letters
I'm not encouraging them to do it all. No, I'm not. In fact, I thought that was
yes.
I thought that was a terrible text and a terrible action. I think that the responsibility of people who are, and again, I respect people who take the decision to stay inside and prevent the worst. I have tremendous respect for that. But again, I think that they are navigating a very, very risky path, and there may come a point when it is necessary for them to say, I will no longer stand for this. And I think that you can see that in Hungary, you can see that in Poland, you can see that in the United States. I think there are, let's not forget, and that'll be my last point, Kemal, I promise.
No, very good.
The authoritarians are far less chaotic and far less incompetent than we would like to persuade ourselves. In fact, they are taking very careful aims at the institutions that make representative democracy effective and legitimate, and are trying to dismantle them. Whether it's the AfD in my country, taking aim at publicly funded media, because they know that those are trusted intermediaries between the governing and the governed, and trying to destroy to make us get rid of the public tax contribution that all of us pay for them, or whether it's the EPA being destroyed in America, or whether it's the Department of Energy being understaffed, so that some of its key functions, its key public safety functions, are impossible to carry out. And that is what we need to watch. It's the destruction not just of sort of norms and alliances, but of domestic institutions. When that happens, you know that you're in trouble.
Thanks, Constanza. I think there are 2 bundles of questions. Let me first go to the one on Brexit, Amanda. It had 2 dimensions to it, the economical aspect and Refik things that could be managed, but the more important political aspect and whether Britain will pass that test. And I know in your in your report you do discuss that. So maybe.
Sure. And first, let me just say one word on this question about climate change as a way to balance populist rhetoric. Not in the United States. I mean, the populists don't believe that climate change is a thing. I mean, if you look at what Trump's comments were a couple days ago, he said maybe it's man-made, but it could maybe be reversed. And I think it is seen as something that is made up by, you know, tree huggers on the left as a way of imposing additional regulation on business. So at least in the United States, I don't see climate change as any way of
Maybe I misinterpreted my question. I was wondering if this could gain. I was wondering if the, climate change could gain
traction,
wide acceptance, and became a voice that could balance the populism.
Yeah.
Not in the U.S. I mean, that's another issue that's extremely polarizing and almost disturbingly partisan in terms of attitudes, especially because for many Republicans, it gets caught into questions about the free market and excessive government regulation, questioning of the scientific evidence behind climate change. So in the U.S., I don't think that would be the case. On Brexit, and as Kamal mentioned, I published a paper on this a week ago. As you said, there's been a lot of focus on what Brexit is going to mean for the European Union. One of my concerns is what Brexit is going to mean for the internal unity of the United Kingdom. And so you will like my paper then. If you look at the two places that I focused on is Scotland and Northern Ireland. I mean, it is possible that we end up with no deal in Brexit because of the inability to resolve the standoff over Northern Ireland. The issue, of course, is the issue with the border in Northern Ireland, because once the UK leaves the European Union, that border ends up becoming a customs border. It's the outer frontier of the European Union. And so there's questions about how you preserve the sanctity of the single market, the internal market within the European Union, if you have this external border with a country that's not a member. Given the legacy of the peace process in Northern Ireland, we celebrated the 20-year anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. It's simply anathema to erect any sort of infrastructure on the border. And so you're getting into very complicated questions about how you handle that. Theresa May's job is made much more difficult because her government is propped up by the Democratic Unionist Party in Northern Ireland, which is objecting to doing any sort of border checks at the Irish Sea rather than on the land border between North and South. So you're getting into lots of complicated political domestic issues in Northern Ireland. There have actually been opinion polls that have come out, one in May showing that attitudes are hardening among the Catholic and nationalist community towards reunification with Ireland as a result of the chaos coming out. There was also a poll that came out about a week ago, even more disturbingly, that said among those in Northern Ireland who had supported Brexit, 87% of them are willing to see the diminishment of the peace process as a cost for delivering Brexit. So tragically, after 20 years of moving past these identity and constitutional debates, Brexit has completely roiled politics in Northern Ireland. The other piece, which I don't think people are focusing on as much, is the question in Scotland. Tony Blair in 1998 devolved power from London to Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. The way the Scotland Act was written, everything that's not reserved to the UK is devolved to these constituent assemblies. This, of course, happened within the context of the European Union. And so now that all these powers are coming back from the EU, things like agriculture, fisheries, environment, there's questions over which level of government is going to exercise these competences. The UK is arguing that they should, because you need a single internal British market for things like agriculture. Scotland is calling this a power grab, and they want these powers to be devolved to them. If Brexit is handled badly, it is quite likely that you'll have a second independence referendum in Scotland. So you could potentially, in a number of years, end up with a situation where you have a reunified Ireland, you have an independent Scotland, and then you have a rump English state with Wales.
Neydi? Dimyat'a giderken pirinçten olmak. There's an expression for that in Turkey. Thanks.
Hopefully a nice
thanks,
one.
Samantha.
Can you translate it?
Well, can someone translate it? It's about how when you're trying to get pirinç, rice, which is higher quality, but in the meantime you lose out on bulgur, which is more basic, you see. And this is a good.
I think it's called cutting your nose to spite your face.
Yeah. All right. Anyway. We still have the big questions, the questions about this disruption being related, whether it's being related to this continuous instability and the failure to deal with that continuous change. I mean, I was last week, I was actually in Switzerland, Zurich, Bern, and Geneva. And in Geneva, we went to the Geneva Center for Security Policy, and it was absolutely frightening what was being presented about artificial intelligence and what that could lead to. I won't go into the details of it, it's probably beyond my competence, but what struck me is what was being said is that technology, and references were made to technology, is growing exponentially, and government is responding to it at best linearly. And I think you're referring to that opening the gap that's becoming wider and wider, and the tension that is generated by it. So there's that question, and then there are parts of the question that Murat Bey raised. Constanza responded to them partly. So what I'll do, maybe Evren, I'll start with you, and we'll make our way to Ziya through Osman Bey. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to take the risk of sounding too academic again, as if I didn't in my first speech. I mean, I love this difference that Ulrich Beck once in the 1990s that between globality and globalization. I think it really is very illuminating in explaining what's going on right now. Well, Ulrich Beck said that about this difference between globality and globalization. When you talk about globality, it's irreversible. It's going to stay with us, it's here, and it's about conjuring of distance, disappearance of closed spaces, using Twitter, Facebook, traveling, all the things we know about globalization. And Beck says that these are not globalization, it's globality. But on the other hand, we have a globalization, which is basically an ideology, which started in the 1980s, and it's market essentialism. It was the ideology of arguing that everything should be regulated according to the logic of the market, and free trade and everything, right? So Beck actually said that that the people at the bottom is actually resisting to the globalization, to this ideology, but they're thinking that they're resisting to the globality. So the difference that we need to do between these two things with the logic of globalization, this market essentialism, that creates a huge inequality with the nations, that gives away all the net gains of the economic wealth, global economic wealth, to the top 1%, is actually what these people are against to, not to the globality. But what the populists are doing actually is they are framing globality as globalization. They're not touching market essentialism. They are not touching to the pockets of that top 1%. Instead, they're getting richer and richer. And they're arguing that this is going to be, I mean, all this ideology can be reversed by economic nationalism, which is not true, right? I mean, so what we need to do, and that goes back to your question, who is responsible and what we should do, we should first start with this difference, right? That's an ideology, that's market essentialism, that works with inequality, that works with this top 1%. So we need to do something about that. I mean, but on the other hand, globality is irreversible. It's there, it's across, I mean, cultural wars, for example, not necessary. It's going to be with us, right? And how to work with this, how to work with that, I think it's very important for an alternative project or utopia to distinguish between these two types of globalization first. When doing that, finding a way to talk about inequality, not just talk about inequality, but putting it as the #1 issue of its political project. especially inequality within nations, and also creating an international order that really is respectful of the rest, not just the West, but the rest, finding ways of integrating them, not saying that these countries are against liberal order, they're anti-Western. I don't think it's enough. It was never enough, it has never been enough, and it's not going to be enough. So we need to find ways of integrating those. And also, of course, we need to find ways of our very cherished and respected liberal institutions that were created after the World War II, but some of them are really failing, right? We need to reform all those institutions as well. So I think the project should be based on that, but unfortunately, and I'm gonna risk being to sound too academic again, and I'm gonna cite Herbert Kitchell's really fascinating book on Exit, Voice, and Loyalty, and where he said that the people who really care about this liberal international order, institutions, democracy, and this and that are actually urban professionals or middle classes, which are shrinking now. But let me say urban professionals. And they are not using their voice anymore. They are using the exit option more and more in Bulgaria, in Hungary, in Turkey, in Russia. And that top 1%, the people who are making money, is doing the same thing as well. They're just leaving their country, right, or taking their business elsewhere, taking other states' citizenships, and they're not really using this voice option. So we need these people, these professionals, urban professionals, economic elites, political elites, people who are educated, who do deeply care about liberal institutions, who deeply care about democracy, to raise their voice more and more. I mean, I'm not saying that they should not use the exit option. They can, but still they have to do something about their own country, which I sometimes call a kind of a yurtsever cosmopolitlik, nationalist cosmopolitanism, some patriotic cosmopolitanism, something like that. I mean, how to create an identity which is both cosmopolitan and also patriotic. So sometimes we give away, you know, like cosmopolitanism in order to be patriotic, and sometimes vice versa. So how to combine these two things together and come up with a different language that failed to respond really to the people's expectations. That's it, I guess.
That was absolutely great and overlapped with some emphasis that was consensus, authoritarian being costless. That was from Balta quoted. But yeah.
I want to combine some of the questions with your remark about the possibility of backlashes. So we've talked about, you know, some of the dark features of you know, retreat of democracy and rise of authoritarian tendencies. And I was also reflecting on this issue of where could change come from. And relating to my own presentation on China and Beijing consensus, one possibility, long-term possibility, is breakdown and transformation within authoritarian state capitalism itself. Now, looking at China, the present regime looks quite robust, but there's a debate that in the medium term, you know, there may be possibilities of change. In fact, the over-concentration of political power in the current era in the Xi presidency may create backlashes. How could the backlash come from? A possible economic political crisis in the longer term due to rising inequality, slowdown of economic growth, rising middle classes demanding more political power. A historical perspective on Asian development perhaps may make us optimistic. You know, I was examining the South Korean case. South Korea, for my generation, you know, my student days, looked very effective in economic terms, but quite authoritarian, and the regime appeared to be quite robust. But in the 1980s, what happened? Due to a number of factors, there was liberalization and democratization. So there seems to be an Asian pattern over time where these political economies are quite authoritarian in their takeoff phase, but then create, due to external and domestic unexpected backlash factors, a tendency for liberalization and democratization. So I think a crucial element for the future of the liberal order would be the political economy of China or authoritarian state capitalism. Whether they can open up politically and economically will have a crucial bearing. The second issue, or the question about right-wing populisms. The institutional links are weak, but right-wing populisms are a global phenomenon. They benefit from each other. So there is a paradox that these are very nationalistic, but at the same time a very global phenomenon where the existence of these right-wing nationalist authoritarian leaders work to the advantage of one another. And when you look at some of the left movements, for example, in Europe, the ideology is more internationalist, more cosmopolitan, but they are much more parochial. You know, look at Podemos, for example, Syriza, the Labour Party under Corbyn. They are much more inward-oriented. Right-wing nationalisms, very assertive nationalism, but a much more global phenomenon. Concerning the backlash, given that there is a domino effect, you know, where the Trump, for example, as Constance aptly put, has a direct effect on Orban, Kaczynski, one possibility of a backlash could be a collapse, an economic and political collapse in one of these cases, which could have a reverse domino effect. So that could be another possibility. I want to take up very briefly the question on Brexit. There was the initial possibility that, you know, Brexit would be followed, and the fear in the European elites was the fear that Brexit would be followed by Pole exit, Hungary exit. But what seems to be happening, which is rather worrying, and I fully agree with you, is that, you know, leaders like Orban are not interested in taking Hungary out of Europe, but they want to change they transform. This is what I call the reverse transformation in my, the idea that we want to create a different kind of Europe by building a set of coalitions and alliances. And how to reverse this process, I think, I truly believe, both from a more general and a Turkish perspective, that Europe is important in a post-European, post-Western world. But Europe meaning the liberal core of Europe, how liberal Europe can rejuvenate itself is a fundamental question. And I fully agree that perhaps the principal change from a positive sense will come from what I would call globalization from below. What we've been discussing are forces of globalization, powerful corporations, powerful states, powerful actors, but the role of civil society, but the challenge there is how to move from national civil societies to building a truly global civil society. How to build the linkages between these, because otherwise, you know, simply, you know, resistance movements at national level may play an important role, but they may not be enough when they are confronted with a truly globalized phenomena, like, you know, this domino effect of global right-wing populisms. So how to build a counter-movement in a Polanyian sense of the word, which is truly global, to deal with these truly global tendencies that we observe.
I realize we have only 2 minutes left. Osman Bey, and the weight of those 2 minutes is on your shoulders in terms of wrapping up this fascinating discussion.
Say 2 sentences. I first would endorse all what Evrim said. So Evren said, and that's a very strong endorsement. And she said it much better than I could say it, so I'm happy for that. And I'll just answer Faruk Bill's question about the fear of continuous change. I think this is a very serious issue, and the technology is developing so fast and transforming all aspects of life in such a radical manner. And as with now more applications with artificial intelligence will again cause huge unemployment in various sectors and various countries and everything. So it is very understandable that a large part of the population, they have iPhones, they are in a way in the game, they are inside the loop, but they are not effective in public decisions and in many other things. And it is very understandable that we can even feel it in our lives that it is very difficult to adapt oneself to such a fundamental change in all areas. And so we must be understanding towards that kind of reaction and take it into consideration because it has eventually political power, and that power resonates into a kind of regressive reaction. But if it can be channelized in a better way, and of course education and all the rest, I mean you have to upgrade the responsiveness of the population and take all the measures, but it is a very valid question and a valid issue, I would say.
Thank you. Thank you for your patience. I hope you enjoyed it. We may have put you through some suffering, but in return we do have a small luncheon reception there that we would like to invite you to participate in. And I'd like to thank the whole panel, those who raised the questions and were engaged, and I'd like to thank Erol Bey. You stayed with us throughout and you also laid the path for this discussion that we had today. Thank you very much, and let's hope for a better world.